All right, well, we've got the audience here now, so let me start the formal introduction. Welcome, everyone, to The Torch of Progress. This is our speaker series for our online summer program called Progress Studies for Young Scholars. This is a program aimed at high school students in the history of technology. And we are running new classes starting every couple of weeks. So if you are interested in this topic, please go ahead, check out our website at progressstudies.school and sign up. We are also putting together a class aimed at older students and adults. So if you're not a teen, not in high school, but you're still interested in this material, also go ahead and sign up, and we are planning something for you. Before we dive into today's event, let me just tell you about a couple of great events we have coming up. We're doing these every week. The next several events are all on Wednesdays at 10 a.m. Pacific time. Next week, July 15th, we have a biotech founder, Noor Siddiqui, who is the founder of Orchid Bioscience. The week after that, July 22nd, we have Dr. Anton, author of the book Arts and Minds, an official history of the RSA that just came out. That's the Royal Society for Arts. And then the week after that, July 29th, we will have Danica, Remy, who is the president of the Asteroid Institute, to give an interesting talk about asteroids and protecting the Earth from asteroid impacts. And we have a number of others lined up after that. Please check out our website, progressstudies.school, to see the schedule. My name is Jason Crawford. I am the author of The Roots of Progress, where I write about the history of technology and the philosophy of progress. And I'm the creator of the course, Progress Studies for Young Scholars. And our guest today here to give us a talk is Dr. Joel Mokyr, very well known in economic history, the author of many books, including, I think the most recent one is A Culture of Growth, which was a deep inspiration to me in starting on my study of human progress. Some of his other well-known books include The Gifts of Athena and The Lever of Riches, and he's written many others besides, as well as, of course, many, many articles. And he's here to give us a talk that he prepared specially for this, so let's give a warm welcome and thank you to Dr. Mokyr.
Thank you. I'm going to go to... There we go. All right. Can everybody see this now?
Yes, it looks great.
Good. Good. All right. Here we go. So this talk is called Attitudes, Aptitudes, and the Emergence of the Modern Economy. And over the last couple of weeks, I actually changed my mind about the introduction. So I'm going to change it a little bit. And I'm going to raise a naive question that's very much inspired by the sort of news of the last few weeks. There is a wave of protests against racial injustice and discrimination, and there's the Black Lives Matter movement. And so thinking about this, I want to pose a really silly and naive question that I don't think anybody else has actually posed, and that is, why really isn't it the other way around? Why don't we ever see Black people who had white slaves, Black people who oppressed white people, discriminated against them, and so on and so forth. And actually, the answer to that isn't obvious. I mean, there's one thing, there's not a smidgen of evidence that in any meaningful way, whites are in biologically different from brown and Black people in a way that gave Europe a political and military advantage. But the fact that everybody recognizes is that over the past say 400, maybe even 500 years, Europeans have dominated and subjugated and enslaved and exploited the rest of humanity in a multiple way. And you wonder why. And this is not just an American problem, it's a global problem. Just look at other hemisphere nations. You look at, say, the way Afro-Brazilians or Afro-Colombians have been treated by whites in those countries. And, it's different, but it's still highly asymmetrical. And even in Europe, where Black slavery, of course, was never introduced on any large scale, we still observe the same thing. You look at France and the UK and other countries, and people of African and Asian descent are discriminated against in a variety of ways, disadvantaged by white people, all the way from mortgage lenders to, police brutality. Just, to keep my terms straight, okay, this isn't quite the same as racism as such, although it's obviously there's a relation. Racism just means disliking others who don't look or sound like you. I'm talking about racism coupled to inequality and asymmetry. That is to say, there's one group that's dominant and one group that's not, and the dominant group is exploiting in some ways the other group. So what's the source of this inequality? And so I would say that if it's not biology, and if it's not geography, then it must be history. Somehow, over time, at some point, white people, that is to say Europeans, acquired some mysterious advantage over the rest of the world, what we call brown and black people, that allowed this inequality to emerge. So it created modern imperialism and the gaps between the incomes of white as opposed to non-white people, which are still, of course, quite large. Now, one point that's really critical is to emphasize that it wasn't always so. If you go back 1,000 years, you go to the year 1000 AD, and you compare Europe with the rest of the world, Europe, was an ignorant, impoverished, violent backwater, in which the, illiteracy rates were probably 99%. Whereas if you look at the world of Islam, or you look at the world of China during the so-called Song Dynasty, these were, by comparison, sophisticated and literate societies that made major advances in a variety of fields such as medicine, mathematics, engineering, philosophy, and on and on and on. And so clearly this is nothing geographical or biological because, obviously there's been some kind of great reversal here. By the 18th century, however, it's there. And so here's a quote from a novel by a very famous British writer called Dr. Johnson, as he's known, Samuel Johnson. And there's some kind of fictional conversation there, which is kind of silly, actually, but here's a quote that isn't. And so, this fictional Abyssinian prince asked his philosopher friend in 1759, so it's just smack in the middle of the 18th century, and he says, by what means are the Europeans thus powerful, or why, since they can so easily visit Asia and Africa for trade or conquest, cannot the Asiatics, 18th century word, Asiatics, and Africans invade their coast, plant colonies in their parts? The same winds that carried them back would bring us thither. The answer that was provided was, they are more powerful than we, sir, because they are wiser. Knowledge will always predominate over ignorance, but why their knowledge is more than ours, I know not. Emphasis added, so I make this way, but that's the critical kind of. So the answer is that, not that they were smarter, but that they knew more, which is, of course, not at all the same thing. And so the answer that Prince Vasilis can't provide is something that I will suggest in this talk, and I will make this summarize this by calling this attitudes and aptitudes. And so at some point in the centuries before Dr. Johnson was writing, Europeans developed both the attitudes and the aptitudes that drove them to acquire the kind of knowledge that gave them an advantage in certain capabilities that ended in white domination and eventually led to slavery, colonialism, and a huge gap in living standards. It's not, of course, true that Europeans were in some ways better educated or more literate. Other civilizations arguably were more so, and the literacy rates in China probably were still higher than in Europe in about 1500. That's not quite what's going on. But what is really going on is what I would call culture. Okay, and now culture is a word that's heavily overused and abused in social sciences and the humanities. I'm going to mean something quite specific, which is sort of beliefs, preference, and values. And what I'm going to argue, I argue in that book, is that between 1450 and 1700, roughly speaking, okay, there were improvements taking place in the European cultural environment in which the idea of progress and the willingness to challenge and control nature to improve the human condition slowly became part of the reigning culture. Now that seems kind of obvious to us, maybe even sort of trivial, but in 1450 it wasn't. Moreover, Europe also created an institutional environment of greater freedom of expression, a greater tolerance for heterodoxy, and above all, the kind of institutions and organizations that provide incentive for people to create new ideas, that is to say, intellectual innovation. So I'm going to single out three important attitudes that I think really counted. Now, I could think of more, so I need to think of this as a very partial list. One of those is skepticism. And so during the Renaissance, say 1450, the Europeans had rediscovered much of the learning of ancient Greece and Rome, and so they obviously realized that there was a lot of wisdom and, oops, sorry about that. Shh, that's my dog. Lily, come here. Sorry. They realized there was a lot of wisdom and learning there, but then they realized there was a lot of error as well. And so what little medieval Europe had of these, of classical knowledge, including some of these great philosophers and scientists, think of people, above all Aristotle, but also geographers like Ptolemy and biologists like Pliny and doctors like Galen, that they thought that this was sacrosanct. This is what you studied in university. But at some point, I would say in the late 15th, early 16th century, such people start having their doubts. And more what you see is people criticizing these kind of classical books. And by 1700, if you think of all the great names of scientific innovators that changed European science, famous people like Copernicus and Galileo and Newton and so on, they created a new science that in many ways contradicted what Europeans had inherited from the classical world. And, basically they start dismissing the classical canon with contempt. That included, by the way, just a side of mine, that included even the Bible. The Bible had always been considered to be sacrosanct. And, and in this period, you see people actually beginning with sort of biblical criticism, essentially realizing that the Bible was written by people and starting to point out contradictions, inconsistency, blah, blah, blah. So this kind of skepticism is all over the map. The second thing is what I call openness. From early times on, and it actually starts already in the Middle Ages, Europeans were willing to learn from other civilizations, even if they didn't like those other civilizations, like Islam, and went to war with them repeatedly. And they readily adopted, or if you want, stole their ideas, and then went on to improve them and make them work better. So after 1500, after Columbus, when they start traveling around the world, they adopt and learn how to make, say, Indian cottons and Chinese silks and porcelain. And they adopted many crops from the Western Hemisphere. Hang on a second, I'm going to put this dog away. Hey, Lily. No. Sorry, I apologize.
All right.
She's still a puppy. So they travel around the world and they see, Chinese and Indian artisans making things, and they say, hey, can we do this too? And they can, and they do, and in the end, they make things better. And so, why did Europeans start touring around the world? So their objective was quite explicitly, to learn and then copy and adopt new forms of technology and medicine, and mathematics. So this is known as the Colombian Exchange, which of course is not quite accurate because a lot of the exchange was happening with Asia. And so this is one of the things that Europeans do, and they start adopting all these new crops, like potatoes and coffee that they discover elsewhere in the world. Now they did this, in addition to the other things that they were doing, which is converting, non-Europeans to Christianity, steal their gold and silver, confiscate their land, enslave them if they could, to grow the kind of crops that the Europeans desired. But their willingness to adopt new technology and new knowledge from other civilizations is quite striking. And this is something quite uniquely European. The Chinese, and even less so the Japanese and Islam, were all very reluctant to adopt European ideas, even so they obviously became available as the Europeans showed up. So the printing press didn't really make it into the Middle East until the middle of the 18th century, 300 years after the Europeans had it. And there's lots of evidence that the Chinese and the Japanese were very reluctant until fairly recently to adopt European technology. The third thing is what I call neophilia. That is to say, developing a taste for things that are new and unfamiliar. And as a result, to reward intellectual innovators. So if you come up with a new idea that catches on, you were rewarded. And some of these people actually became, by the standards of the time, celebs. None more so than, the great Isaac Newton, who was kind of an idol in his time. And, his students were sitting at his feet and listening to the great master. And 100,000 people showed up in 1727 for his funeral. I mean, he wasn't really a superstar, but there are lots of other superstars like that. And these were all people who had come up with new ideas and became quite famous. And many of these leading scientists, or as they're called natural philosophers, they weren't called scientists, they sort of became, as I said, celebrities, and they, as a result, landed posh and comfortable patronage positions as Galileo did, and Leibniz, and many others. And so the result, of course, is that if you incentivize these things right, a lot of radical new ideas that were proposed between 1500 and 1750, many of these were developed by the Europeans themselves. But some of them, as I said, were adopted from elsewhere, and Europeans didn't mind at all. In fact, they quite proudly named their new products after the place where they took them from. So we still use the word Chinaware for porcelain, which basically indicates that, yeah, we got this from China, or calicos, or, turkeys. I mean, you can go on like that. Now, obviously, not all the ideas that they developed and still were good ideas. A lot of these ideas were bogus, particularly in medicine, but in other areas as well. Some of them were mistaken. But wherever possible, they were put to good use. And if people want some examples, I will provide them in the Q&A section. Okay, so now I talked about attitudes. Now let me say something about aptitudes. Okay, so as I said, Europeans produced a lot of new ideas, but the problem was that even if these were in principle sound, they often couldn't be realized. Okay, so the best example that I have of that is Leonardo. So Leonardo, as I think you may have seen it, and if you went to some kind of museum in Italy or looked at some books, so he was a technological genius who invented literally hundreds of machines, many of whom were actually quite sound. And so he drew these, and here's a picture of if you look here carefully at the bottom, you will see a sort of a drawing of something that would work like a helicopter. This, of course, it would be a flying machine, but there are things like pumps and kind of hoisting machines and you name it. Now, of these machines, none was ever built in his lifetime, or in fact, after it. And it's not alone. It's not Leonardo alone. Here are two inventions that actually worked, but they couldn't really be commercially realized or scaled up. So on the left, you see a submarine, this little brown thing in the water with the arrows sticking out. That's a submarine. That's a submarine built in 1620 in London by a Dutchman called Cornelis Drebbel. And it worked, but it was just this model worked, but nobody could ever produce a lot of them because they were too expensive or they didn't work in some way. On the right, you have one of the first mechanical calculators ever built. This was built by a Frenchman called Blaise Pascal. You see what it looks. This is a reconstruction. This is not the original. But you get, but neither submarines nor mechanical calculators came into widespread use for hundreds of years because they just couldn't be scaled up and produced effectively. And the answer is quite obvious. It's workmanship and materials. People just couldn't make these things because they didn't have the right materials and they didn't have the right aptitude. Okay, so my thinking about this is that this kind of aptitude is a form of knowledge that's what we call complementary to the inventions. This is the term economists use, and basically says that inventions need artisans to build them, but artisans need new ideas by inventors. So that's the notion of them making each other stronger, which is fundamentally then the concept of complementarity as economists use it. And this was emerging in this time, but at the time of Leonardo, or even the time of Drebel and Pascal, it wasn't quite there. Over time, however, Europe is acquiring an advantage in aptitude as well. And so you can actually see this by looking at a variety of different techniques. So if you start, say, let's go to the year 1400, just before the great voyages, okay? And I would say that most people would agree that compared to Europe, as late as 1400, the Chinese still had superior technological capabilities in a whole variety of sectors: shipbuilding, navigation, iron making, hydraulics, and textiles. No. But if you look carefully, you see the Europeans are starting to catch up. Now, 200 years later, when the first Jesuits arrive in China and contact is established between Europe and China, and it's really just the Jesuits who are allowed into China, and of course no Chinese show up in Europe. But by the late 17th century, 16th century, 1582, the Jesuits arrive in China, trying to convert the Chinese, of course, that's their main purpose. But they're pretty smart guys, and they notice how backward China is in many areas. So there's an Italian Jesuit called Matteo Ricci, who points out that the Chinese used to have these skills in things that they were very good at, clockmaking and shipbuilding especially, but now the Europeans are actually better and they have to teach them. The same was true for astronomy, measuring time and on and on. So it's still probably true that by, say, the 16th century, Asia still has a highly skilled class of artisans who produce many of the goods that Europeans wanted. Things like Chinese porcelain or Indian cottons and things like that. But that advantage is slowly disappearing. By 1700, European artisans are quickly improving. This is especially true in Britain, which is clearly the leading nation in terms of the quality of its artisans. But it's not just Britain. And so I brought you these two pictures to show you that even on the continent, these capabilities had improved a great deal. So on the left, you see this duck. Now, this is a mechanical duck that actually can walk and quack and actually defecate. Believe it or not, it was built as a toy for the rich and the bored by a man called Jacques de Vaucanson in about 1730. On the right, you see a very different skill of violin making. This is actually a picture in the Violin Museum in Cremona, Italy. And these violins, they were so good. We still can't make them better than what these masters. So this is a set of skills that is emerging. And I would say by 1700, you see the Europeans developing this skill at an ever faster rate. And so what I would argue, and this sort of summarizes my view on this, is that the growth and the quality of workmanship and materials in the preceding centuries helps explain the timing and location of the Industrial Revolution, first in England, and then, of course, in France, in Germany, and other continental countries. And so you may well ask, as I do ask my students, why is it that when you look at Leonardo's inventions, in the late 15th, early 16th century, you ask yourself, why did they never become a reality? Whereas when James Watt, the great engineer, develops a better and more efficient steam engine, why did he succeed? And so I wrote a little poem about this, which is the only poem you'll ever hear from me, okay? But this is a poem I'm very proud of, okay? And this is the poem. The poem says, the difference between Leonardo and Watt was that Watt had Wilkinson and Leonardo did not. Now, this is not going to get me the Nobel Prize in literature, I'm afraid, but it does make a point that's really worth making. And that this is, I'm not sure this thing isn't blocking it, but this is a man called John Wilkinson. And Wilkinson was he looks in his Sunday clothes here, but he was actually essentially an iron founder. So he obviously was a guy good with his hands. And he developed a machine that could bore cylinders at a very high level of accuracy. And of course, you can build a steam engine, that's what you need, because the piston goes inside a cylinder. And if the fit isn't quite snug, you're not going to get, the steam engine to do the work it's supposed to do. And so it wasn't enough for Watt and other people to think of a steam engine. You needed guys to build it. The picture you're seeing here is a guy who could build it. And without him, Watt would not have become famous, and we would not have had steam power. Now, it's not just him, of course, it's him and people like him. But they were there in Britain in the 18th century, and they were not there in the 16th century. So if you had invented a steam engine in the 16th century, which is not likely, and you wouldn't have built it anyway. And so what Dr. Johnson, to come back for him, was talking about is to some extent mechanical skills. But there's more to it than that. And that's something I do want to point out. And that is that, if you look at knowledge, basically there's sort of two kinds of knowledge. There's people who make things, or the French call them fabricants, these are artisans, industrialists, if you want, farmers. And then there's people who know things, scientists, natural philosophers, mathematicians. And these are, roughly speaking, separate groups. But what is really important is that these groups talk to each other and communicate. And this is something that was quite realized at the time. And even Isaac Newton himself, who actually was probably more of an ivory tower scientist than most of his colleagues, basically said the geometry was devised not for the purpose of bare speculation, meaning sort of, theory, we will call that, but for workaday use, by which he meant that its technique should be such that any practitioner should find them readily applicable in his measuring. So that's, I think, essentially the culture of the time. And I have called this the Industrial Enlightenment. So the Enlightenment is a big, complicated cultural movement, but the Industrial Enlightenment is just a subsection of it, a slice of it, if you want, that's actually thinking explicitly about progress and how to bring it about. And what is really striking is that in the 18th century, scientists were not really theorists. They've really become very interested in practical problems, even the great Isaac Newton, but others much more so. And these people have no qualms of getting some kind of dirt under their fingernails, okay? So they're not ivory tower people. Here is one example. I think of the great chemist Joseph Priestley, who discovered oxygen in 1774. He died in Pennsylvania, by the way, long story. But Priestley, who was a leading intellectual and actually a serious political thinker, also invented two things we still use. One of them is sparkling water or carbonated water, and the other is the pencil eraser. Well, we don't use that very much anymore because nobody's writing with pencil, but certainly it was something that was of considerable importance. Here's my favorite example of this, somebody you might not have heard of yet, also you should, but this is a typical, what I'd call an Industrial Enlightenment man, Okay, this is not an Englishman, it's a Frenchman, Rene. These are his dates, so you can sort of see living the first part of the 18th century. That's his picture. And so he's trained as a mathematician, and he's a very big Mokyr in French science. He's a lifelong member of the French Académie Royale, where all the sort of elite scientists were members and so on. But he wrote, if you look at his writing, he worries about iron and steel and why steel is so much stronger than iron. He wonders about porcelain and glazing, which the Europeans were just adopting from China. He's worried about, biology, egg incubation. He writes a book about entomology. He worries about temperature measurement. There used to be a Reaumur measure, to compete with our Fahrenheit and European Celsius. I don't think anybody uses it anymore. He suggested paper to be made from wood rather than rags. We can go on and on, but this is obviously a scientist who quite explicitly takes pride in solving practical problems. So in Britain, this is even stronger. And so you actually see scientists and industrialists seeking each other out and talking. The best example of this is very famous. This is the Lunar Society of Birmingham. It's called the Lunar Society. And they call themselves actually as lunatics, which of course they don't mean crazy people. It's called Lunar Society because they met at full moon. You can see this full moon sort of in the background of the picture, because that's when the streets of Birmingham were passable at night because they didn't have street lighting yet. So at least that's the story. So they're sitting around the table, and some of these people are quite famous: Matthew Boulton, Erasmus Darwin, the grandfather of the great Charles Darwin. James Watt is there. So this is the sort of really the top minds of British manufacturers and scientists, and they're talking about practical issues. How do you make this? How do you solve this problem? And that's, I think, something very specific to Europe. So basically, just to sum up, modern economic growth, which came out of the Industrial Revolution, was driven by this combination of attitude and aptitude. And that really created the background of the Industrial Revolution and of our current wealth. So you have to understand, to come back to the sort of issue of progress, it isn't enough to believe in progress in the sense that you think this can happen and this should happen. What these people did was they suggested a way in which it was to be achieved and to carry it out. So the net result is that we are richer than we have ever been. And here is one of the ironies of history. And history can be sometimes deeply ironic. Think about it. So Europeans used this knowledge to get richer, but they also used this knowledge to subjugate and exploit people elsewhere in the world. 19th century colonialism. But it's still true that the descendants of these subjugated people in Asia, in Africa, even in Latin America, are today far richer than their ancestors 200 years ago, thanks to this European knowledge. So it's sort of a good news, bad news kind of story, and both of them are very much part of our story. So let me just sum up and ask a question that some of you may be wondering about. What about the future, and can progress continue? And so here is my thinking about it today. And that's essentially in terms of our ability to develop new technology, the answer is almost surely yes. We keep inventing things. We keep breaking new ground in a variety of scientific areas that we never deemed to be possible. We now have computational this and computational that. Science and technology are progressing as fast as they ever have, and maybe faster. There's some people that think it isn't, but I've had this debate with others, and the answer is they're wrong. But what we should keep in mind, and I want you to all think about this hard and long, is it's not enough to come up with new knowledge. You also need the right institutional and political environment. You need things that we talk about and that we take for granted until we don't have them. Things like liberty, a civil society, relatively free markets, human rights, the rule of law, tolerance of others, a balance of power between the branches of government, and social justice. And there is no guarantee that these will continue to progress. And in some areas of the world, there is serious concern that they may be regressing. One of the great economic historians of our time, now deceased, unfortunately, the great Douglas North, once said to me, and I knew him well, he said to me, Joel, there's an interesting thing. In economic history, we talk about technological progress, but institutional change. And what this implies is that technology progresses. It gets better and better over time, as long as we don't forget what we did before. Institutions change. They go up, they go down, they get better, they get worse. There's nothing that guarantees that they will get better. And there are long periods in which they haven't, historically as well as our own time. And so I put this up there as the heading, sort of the institutional progress versus technological progress. And I put institutional progress in quotes because that's not at all guaranteed. And so I want to end up with a quote from Sigmund Freud, of all people, almost a century ago now, written in the book of The Future of an Illusion. And here's the quote: "While mankind has made continual advances in its control over nature and may be expected to make still greater ones, it is not possible to establish with certainty that a similar advance has been made in the management of human affairs." And I would say that's probably the understatement of the century. And this is very understated, but clearly Freud agrees with North. That is to say, we will get better and better in our control over nature and over technology and science, but the management of human affairs, which is his way of talking about institutions, it's not at all clear that an advance will be made. And if the discrepancy or the gap between the two keeps growing, that could be a source of great concern. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Dr. Mokyr. That was great. And we've got about 20 minutes now, a little over 20 minutes to take some questions. So for students in the course, go ahead and ask them in the Slack for the course, and I'll try to give priority to your questions. Anybody else, go ahead and just type them into the chat here in Zoom, and I'm going to play moderator and sort of pick out some questions. And I'm going to go ahead and take moderator's privilege to ask a question or two of my own to start. I've been it was about 3 years ago or a little more that I read A Culture of Growth, and it really started me off thinking about a lot of these issues. One question I've been dying to ask you ever since. Francis Bacon in the 1500s, you write about sort of, had this idea that we could do science and it would lead to improvements in industry. And it seems to me that it took about 200 years for that to come true. How did a whole culture of people keep trying and hold on to this vision for 200 years, without having the Industrial Revolution yet? Why didn't they all give up, like 100 years in? What were they, how were they holding on to that vision?
It's a very good question, because the fact of the matter is that what Bacon was suggesting is that we should study nature and learn more about how nature works, physics, chemistry, biology, and so forth, so we can apply it. And almost nothing that people tried actually worked. For a very long time, they tried this and they tried that, and most of the things didn't work. Whatever progress we see before 1700, really, it's very hard to see science having, doing very much for technology at all. And so this is actually a really cool question. Now you have to understand, however, that this is to some extent, a self-promoting piece of propaganda by scientists. To say you have a lot of people who do science. And I'm not so much thinking about Newton, who's kind of an oddball, but you look at people like Boyle and Hooke and a whole bunch of Frenchmen. These people basically say, look, we're scientists, or we're natural philosophers, and we study medicine, and we study botany, and you should really subsidize us because this will be terribly useful. And well, it's not useful yet, but if you give us enough support, it will become useful. And so they basically, in some way, convince authorities, and which are basically would be princes and patrons, to keep subsidizing them, to keep sponsoring them, and so on and so forth. Believing themselves, I think that this was true, but also realizing how hard the problem was. And but it's still, I don't know, amazing that it isn't really until a century after Bacon makes these points that you start seeing little pieces of evidence that science can help here and there. But remember, of course, that there is a whole sort of Baconian tradition in Britain. The Royal Society, which is founded, decades after Bacon's death, is really written in the Baconian tradition. And there's this famous poem that was written by a contemporary poet, better than I am, but still not very good, who basically says that Bacon was like Moses, that he was allowed to behold the promised land, but not to enter it. Always thought it was a little bit absurd, but there's some truth to that. You had to wait 100 years, but this is, I think Europe is really ready for this, and people, this is what once you start believing that progress is possible and that it's desirable. There's only two ways of bringing it about. The first is to expand useful knowledge so that you can have better technology. And the second thing is to try to improve institutions, to get, have a more reasonable government. And that's what we typically think that Enlightenment writers like Locke and Montesquieu and so on were doing. But what you're saying is rather surprising. And what is even more surprising is that you don't see this anywhere else. You look at the Islamic world, you look at India, you look at China, you find nothing like this. In China, if you dig deep enough, you can find, a few, because lots of really smart Chinese, and some of them actually say similar things, and they disappear without a trace. Whereas in Europe, Bacon becomes, certainly in the 18th century, Bacon becomes, an idol. You read books at the time, everybody is quoted. Bacon, they really buy into this stuff, lock, stock, and barrel. But that it did survive that long without providing any fruit is still rather surprising.
Yeah. I'll ask one more question, then I'll go to the questions from the audience. Last week we had on here for an interview Professor Deirdre McCloskey, and she really emphasizes. I would say more of the kind of, moral and social, aspects of honor and dignity, and how that led to more liberty for I guess, inventors and industrialists and so forth. You really emphasize the epistemological. Do you see these as complementary? Can these be combined? How do you compare or think about
I don't see any contradiction there. I mean, we're just basically looking at the elephant, and we're both looking at different parts of the elephant, and we think it's the whole elephant. So I've known Deirdre for 50 years, and reviewed her books, and we're very close friends, and so we don't actually fight over this. We both agree that ideas matter, that what people believe is actually relevant to the outcomes. It's a very sort of anti-materialist interpretation. Marx would have said, "Oh no, ideas don't matter. Ideas are a result of deeper factors." And we think, no, ideas are part of the deeper factors that determine outcomes. That's, I think, what we both believe. Now, my emphasis, much more than Deirdre, is on invention, innovation, and technology. I really believe that what's driving modern growth is novelty. It's innovation. It's new ways of making things and new products that weren't even in existence at all. And that I think is critical. I want to know where these things are coming from. Who creates them? Why do they create them? What would, do you have to know to build a machine that works better? Sometimes you have to know science. Sometimes you have to know math. Sometimes you just tinker around and it pops up. Her view is much more about sort of what do people think about the ethics of enrichment and accumulation. Is it socially okay to be a merchant or an artisan, or should everybody strive to be, a leisurely country gentleman? And so, how do people regard production and manufacturing and efficiency in society? And if you think that this is all idleness, and if this is really all sinful, that's a very different world than a world in which these things become acceptable. And what she called sort of the bourgeois ethic. Bourgeois ethic is really about how acceptable these things are. And I don't think there is a contradiction. I am basically focusing on the sort of most creative, most able people in society. I'm a firm believer in the statement that economic growth is created by the top 2-3% of the workforce, and that the other 97% are just being dragged along, so to speak. It's not everybody can be an inventor, not everybody can be a leading chemist or an innovative doctor or whatever. Okay, so it's a few people, and then the knowledge that they generate eventually sort of filters down to the rest of the population. That's how it happens. And so I focus on those top 3% or 2%, whatever they are, of entrepreneurs, of industrialists, of inventors, of top engineers. I think she is looking at a much larger set of the population on how are these people being regarded. And I think that those are both valid points of view. So there's no contradiction there. The important thing is where we agree. And where we agree above all is that ideas matter, that values matter, that attitudes matter, and that these attitudes are what we need to explain. It's much harder to explain attitudes than to explain relative prices. We know what determines prices. We know supply and demand. We know economics. Where ideas come from, and more important, why do some ideas get accepted and become part of the dominant culture? That's much harder to understand, and we're just really beginning to understand that. There have been major cultural changes in our own time, which people are still struggling to understand. You look at the last 20, 30 years. I mean, since I came to the United States in 1970, there's been major changes in attitudes toward all kinds of things, and not in others. And students ask me, so why is it that some cultural change things change so rapidly and others don't? And we're still struggling with that, but it matters. That's the important thing, and economists ignore them at their peril.
Yeah. All right, we've got about 10 minutes left, so I'm going to let's get to some questions from our students and audience. Juan David asks about countries that are maybe these attitudes that you talked about, countries like the US that are going, or some of them going backwards in towards these attitudes, or other countries following, these sort of three attitudes. And if countries like the US are going backwards, what can we do about it? Can we solve that? Is that a problem? Can we solve it?
I think it's too early to say that we are going backwards. Clearly, there are within the United States, there has always been sort of an anti-intellectual tradition. We are the only country in the world, as far as I know, that has a creationist museum. So there's always been a minority of people who have resisted change. Some of them for religious reasons. I think that they're in favor of a literalist interpretation of the Bible. There also is a very different I think, anti-progress movement, which is also to some extent religious in nature, but a different kind of religion that's extreme environmentalists who basically think growth is bad because we're destroying nature and we are, we're playing God and we'll do unspeakable things to the planet. Now, these are two powerful groups, but they're obviously coming from very different directions. And in between, there's a bunch of people like me who basically say, look, without progress, without new knowledge, eventually we will stagnate and we won't be able to cope with the challenges ahead of us. And so, it's a political struggle for the hearts of minds of the American people. But here is a thought I want to plant into your head, Juan, and that is that if we're still looking at a highly diverse and splintered world. Okay, I mean, we have 180 countries. You can organize them in 4 or 5 major blocks. North America and the EU and China and whatnot. But these blocks are separate, right? They're competing with each other. And here's the problem. The problem is that if you may not like progress, you may think it's a bad idea, and I really like to stop it. But if these other people adopt it, then the notion is we really can't afford to not do this because otherwise they will. So, if there's a set of technologies that are ruled out by your society for some ideological reason, what will happen is it will get developed somewhere else. The best example I can give you is the resistance that you see in Europe to genetically modified organisms. Okay? So this is a really, I think of this as a reactionary and largely irrational movement driven by farmers trying to protect their turf, but also by well-meaning but misguided environmental ideologues who basically, think in terms of frankenfoods and other sort of silly concepts. But the problem that Europeans will be facing is that if they don't do it, we'll do it. And if we'll stop it, somebody in the Caribbean will do it, or the Chinese will, or, in the middle, somebody will do it. And if somebody does it and they acquire major advantage on us, okay, that will prompt us to adopt it simply because otherwise we'll fall behind. We have seen this happen in history. We have seen nations that objected to progress, and eventually they would have to catch up because the rest of the world was moving ahead. The best example that history provides us is that Japan closed itself off virtually, and not entirely, but virtually from the rest of the world in 1600. And then in the middle of the 19th century, so 250 years later, all of a sudden these American ships show up, right? Admiral Perry shows up, and the Japanese are looking and say, look at what these Westerners have achieved. And then they junk their whole sort of resistance to technology, and they become big innovators because they realize otherwise they will be eaten up by the Westerners. In some ways, the Chinese underwent through the same process also. Fortunately for them, it took them a lot more time and a lot more effort. But essentially, this is the way history is. So as long as the world remains politically competitive, I don't think the United States or anybody else can afford to fall behind. And so in that regard, I think progressive ideology will remain dominant, even though there are powerful forces massed against it, anti-science, anti-intellectual forces are all, not just here, but everywhere. But they will, I think, lose out for that reason.
Okay. Vital asks, our education system seems to emphasize factual learning. Do you think that might be reducing creativity and thus slowing down progress?
No, I don't think that a supply of creativity is our problem. As I said, for progress to occur, we don't need to have 100% of the population to be creative. We don't need, 90% of the population to be creative. Most people are not, let's face it, most people are not that creative in the sense that they're capable of pushing the envelope in science, in mathematics, in medicine, in whatever. That's not the way it works. We have enough incentives in place to encourage creativity among the sort of top people who go to, what really counts here is that we have in the United States developed a set of institutions, mostly sort of top-rated universities, in where we create a great deal of innovation by attracting the absolute best and brightest, not just of the United States, by the way, but of the rest of the world. So as long as we will keep having institutions such as Caltech and MIT and Carnegie Mellon and Northwestern and places like that, I think creativity is not going to be the problem. What we do and what we still have is a system that rewards creativity. And that is, I mean, you become a successful creative science, okay? You become a celebrity. You win a Nobel Prize. You get, all kinds of goodies. That will get creativity out of people. The problem is not that we have too little creativity. Some ways we have too much. I just heard this morning on National Public Radio, somebody pointed out that since the beginning of the COVID pandemic, 6,000 papers have been published on the subject of COVID. I mean, we're not looking for people, to be creative. We have to. Our big task will be to separate the wheat from the chaff. There's a lot of good creativity, but there's much more bogus creativity. And so, our system. I think. My complaint about. I have many complaints about the American educational system. I'm not worried about creativity being in short supply. People will be creative as long as the environment allows it, and as long as the incentives are there, and as long as they have the time to be creative, which we do. So I think we're fine in that regard. Now, is our educational system perfect? My God, no. But don't get me going on this, because I can speak there both as an educator and as a father, and I have many complaints about the American educational system, but it still has been delivering for us. And so, words and all, I say, that's not what keeps me up at night.
All right. Let's see if we can get in maybe one more question. So Benjamin asks, so you mentioned we have 3% of the people who are sort of the innovators, maybe dragging along the other 97. Could we have more than 3% if we had open borders in terms of immigration and brought in more people?
My favorite topic. Man, this is true. I mean, if you look at the numbers, you look at the number of people foreign born in top universities in the United States, but not just, but also in unicorn companies, they are full of people born outside the United States. We have been attracting these people for years, and we are attracting the best and the brightest from India, from China, from Israel, from Europe. They're all over. You look at even in my own profession in economics, which is not really an engineering, sort of science and engineering type of profession. Half the department in Maine where I am, no, more than half, 2/3 of the department are people born outside the United States. I mean, this is always been our strength, is attracting the best and the brightest. Any policy that discourages this is utterly insane. Much of the greatness of American technology, I mean, I used to have a colleague who pointed out, he says, the best thing that ever happened to American higher education was Adolf Hitler, because he chased out all the sort of top Jewish professors, many of whom ended up in the United States. And they started, physics and chemistry departments, medical schools, and so on. These people had been trained in Germany, but they had to leave. So they came here. We should have been welcoming them more, but we still brought in people like Einstein and Bethe and so on and so forth, and found a place for them. That is a policy, that I really hope we keep engaging in, because the United States has been a huge beneficiary of attracting the best and the brightest from the rest of the world, and cutting that off is just lunatic. Thanks for that question, by the way. This is something I feel quite strongly about.
I agree. I agree. And we're not doing well on that score today.
We are certainly not doing well.
Yeah. We're at the bottom of the hour, so we're going to have to end it here. Unfortunately, this has been great, and I wish we could go on and ask you lots more questions. If people want to learn more about your work or follow your work, what's the best way for them to get more from you?
Oh, you can go to my website. I have a website. You just go into the Northwestern Economics Department and you click on my name, and you should get to my website. There's a fair number of papers in there that you can see. I mean, the papers tend to be most of them tend to be probably a bit technical, lots of numbers, lots of estimations, things like that. But I have a couple of small things that people may find interesting, including my reflections on the current COVID crisis. So if you're interested in that, actually, best thing you should do is just fire off an email. My email address is on that website, and I'll be glad to send you some stuff.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, and have a great day. And I think we all
my pleasure. And please, everybody, stay safe.
Yes, absolutely, and you too. All right.
Bye bye.
Take care. Thank you very much, Dr.
Bye bye.
All right. So long, everybody.